when we look at AI models and machine learning, typically those are able to be utilized when we get hundreds of data points. And so now with a more robust sampling program, we're able to develop this really big data set that we can leverage these AI tools on.
Welcome to another season of the Rumination Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Gwynn, and today I'm really pleased and joyed to have a discussion to talk about related to feed and forage labs and how you can utilize this information and lab services to improve the performance of your rations right down to the cow level. And I'm honored to have joining us today, Katie Raver of the Rock River Laboratory Incorporated. And so let's start by giving you a little bit of background about Katie that she shared with us. So growing up in rural Illinois, Katie Raver developed this passion for agriculture at a very young age. While attaining her undergraduate degree in animal science at the University of Illinois, she immersed herself in the dairy industry. After completing her undergraduate degree, she completed a summer internship at the Rock River Laboratory and further developed her passion for forage and feed quality. So upon returning to the University of Illinois for her master's degree in ruminant nutrition with Dr. Phil Cardozo, she was able to further explore these interests as her graduate work focused on forage quality and fungal disease. She then moved to Texas after finishing her degree. Today, she's been at Rock River Laboratory for the past 5 years, and in her current role as Animal Nutrition Technical Service Director, she oversees technical support and development. Her interests include forage quality, assessment, and understanding how the environment and management conditions impact forage quality. She also has a deep-seated interest in exploring ways to improve feed efficiency on farms and how data can be used to maximize the value of feeds on farms. So today, I really want to welcome to the Rumination Podcast, Katie Raver.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me here today. I'm so excited to talk about feed. It is one of my favorite topics to discuss, and so I'm at a nice home at the feed laboratory because I get a lot of chances to talk about feed.
Well, we're excited to share your experience and knowledge with our listening audience. So let's dig a little bit deeper in today's topic of the podcast, using the concept of using the lab data as a ration validation tool, not just for formulation input. So I believe in the past, in some of the content you've created and presentations you've done, you've talked about the forage and feed lab results, more than just numbers for forage, for feed formulation. These are tools to validate whether a ration is actually working. So from your experience, how should nutritionists be using laboratory analysis to confirm what's on paper is translating to performance in the feed intake at the farm level?
Absolutely, and this is a fantastic question. A lot of times when we get a feed analysis, we use those feed analyses to formulate our ration. So we'll pull those into a model and build a ration around those, and that's kind of a paramount reason why we sample feed. But I think there's a lot of value beyond that. And so while typically our focus is centered around those forages and feeds that we think are more variable, even testing things like commodities can help us confirm what we put into that model is what's getting fed to cows. So again, feed testing can be a great way to validate this. And we can even do this from testing our TMR and making sure what is coming out in the feed mixer and getting fed to cows matches what we have formulated. One of the challenges with that is what happens when those don't match. So where can we go back and use the data that we've got from our feed analysis to help uncover more of that as well? So whether it be furthering our forage testing, looking at our commodity testing, using that to even open up other avenues like Easy Feed or Feed Watch, these feed management programs to figure out, hey, was my ration mixed properly according to what it was mixed or formulated as? These are all ways feed analysis can help us dig into validating what we think we're feeding and what actually is feeding, or what we're actually feeding.
No, absolutely. And so on that, and I've noticed a lot of discussion over the last number of years on setting up more structured feed analysis plans at the farm level. And so what do you find that's really working for that scenario? And I know it ties into size of farm and usage rates, et cetera, but what are you finding as kind of minimum recommendations on feed and forage testing or TMR testing that that your clients that are having the most success are following?
Absolutely. Fantastic question. One thing here that you mentioned is it's definitely based on a farm by farm situation. And so we have to take into a lot of factors when we set out a sampling recommendation. One of the biggest surprises that came to me when we kind of came out with this structure of trying to create a more scheduled sampling routine is labor. So we have to make sure that we've got someone that's capable of taking those samples, that we trust to take those samples, whether it be someone on farm or the nutritionists themselves. We've got to make sure that we can get that part of the equation taken care of. So we have to appropriately set our sampling volume to make sure that it matches what can be done from a logistics standpoint. But beyond that, again, farm size is a big contributor to how we set up that sampling schedule, and then feed usage. So some of the key points that we've focused in on and we really feel that appropriate that haven't really changed over the last 10 to 15 years is the recommendation of sampling feeds more that we're using 4 or more pounds of. So if we're using 4 pounds in the ration, that's kind of an Ohio State recommendation. But if we're using more of that 4 pounds in the ration, might be a little bit smaller for our Jersey cows, but then we're going to want to focus on those feeds and sampling those feeds. And then beyond that, the feeds that we're using more of, so corn grain, we may be feeding 10, 12 pounds of. We may want to sample that more frequently to mirror the usage of those feeds. And then obviously our forages, we would set up at a even more routine frequency yet. So we really weight it based off of the usage and what the farm can accomplish along with farm size. So from there, then we do work with farms to set up a schedule that really works for them. It's very flexible, but we've seen success with sampling as much as 3 to 5 times a week for our very, very large farms, and as low as 1 every week, 2 every 10 days or 2 weeks, as long as we're making that sampling schedule represent a meaningful time frame, meaning how often are we capable of using this data to make changes? Is it representative of the flow of the feed through the operation? And is it giving us valuable trends? Because then when we do set that sampling schedule, then we can start to track these trends over time and understand how our feed has changed, maybe what direction our feed is changing in the future, so we can adjust our ration to these changes and take and capture that economic benefit that often comes with these feed changes as well.
Yeah, because that's what it's about. And so you talked about being able to work with farms and nutritionists to figure that out. So this brings my thought to tools that you might have or that's available in the industry to help producers or nutritionists calculate, frequency of testing. And that just brings up the world of what else is new in laboratory testing that nutritionists and producers should be looking more closely at.
Absolutely. So, in terms of tools to establish a testing routine, would just simply be creating a list of the feeds that we're feeding, usage rates. So then we can parse those out or schedule those out according to usage. And we've got some tools built to help producers do that. And we can do that a lot of times through discussion, because some of those will fine tune a little bit based off their interests. So they say, hey, I've got particular interest in this forage crop, then we can fine tune it a little bit more. I think being flexible to dairies is what's enabled us to really capture the most benefit, because then we're able to fine tune these programs to really what matters to them and help them achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve. And as you mentioned, what else can we do with this information? And that's the really cool part, is once we get this robust data frame, that opens up a lot of opportunities for us to do more with those customers and provide more insight back. So some new tools would be being able to trend and track this over time. So if we get a robust enough data set, we can use trend tracking tools and statistics to look at how that feed is changing over time and automatically notify the producer and the nutritionist if we detect that feed is changing. So we can send push notifications to let you know, hey, starch is increasing in your corn silage. Maybe you want to keep an eye on this, or maybe your fiber digestibility is increasing. We even do this with commodities when they're sampled enough, so we can know we can alert them if, say, crude protein is changing in their soybean meal, starch is changing in corn grain. So all these things that are dynamic, that are moving, it allows us to better bring that data set down to something that's usable and manageable on dairies. So I think one of the challenges that we run into with this idea of more frequent sampling is that people become inundated with data very quickly. So if we send out a report, for all of these samples that we're testing, every time we test a sample, we're getting anywhere from 3 to 5 reports 3 times a week. That's a lot of data to weed through. So how do we take that immense amount of data and weed it down into something meaningful? And those push notifications have allowed us to do that. And so that's a really cool thing that we can get into when we get enough data to build those.
And just because it's a topic of conversation in the industry, artificial intelligence, there must be discussions within the laboratory industry of how that's going to impact these type of push notifications and trend detections on forages and feeds.
Absolutely. And I don't have a good answer for that yet, but I think the very cool thing is that as we build those robust data sets, we can start leveraging these tools. So one of the challenges previous to where we sit right now with AI and machine learning on feed is that for the grand majority of our farms, we don't have a very big data set, especially compared to when we look at things like milk production or reproduction, where we're tracking those events really, really frequently. Feed sampling, we maybe do every other week. And so if we think about 52 weeks in a year, we have about 25 data points per feed per year. So one of the challenges when we think about AI models and feedstuffs is that compared to other data sets on farms, such as reproduction or milk production, we don't actually have a lot of data points for our feedstuffs. So when we think about our traditional feed sample model, we're sampling those forages every other week. And so 52 weeks in a year, maybe we get 25 data points every year. When we look at AI models and machine learning, typically those are able to be utilized when we get hundreds of data points. And so now with a more robust sampling program, we're able to develop this really big data set that we can leverage these AI tools on. And we can utilize these to help us understand what's going on with our feed right now and those trends those changes that have happened. But hopefully also as we look into the future, what might be changing with what might be to come and what might be to change with our feeds.
No, that's fantastic. And thanks for sharing those insights. It's always this trend analysis and prediction is so important with what you're trying to do. So commend you on that. Wanted to take a little bit of a pivot and look at feed hygiene. This is something that you studied in your master's and you've talked about, and I think you've talked about it as this kind of hidden limiter of ration success. So with that in mind, I think you've talked about things like ash, of course, and fermentation quality, but microbial load, of course, is maybe a bit more nouveau in the scene of having this discussion about the cleanliness of the feed. So with that in mind, what are some of the common feed hygiene issues that you see in rations that's preventing the performance that we expect? And then furthermore, how can we help producer nutritionists be aware of that as well as to minimize this type of negative hygiene interactions on the feeds, whether it's a finished feed or nutrients going in?
Absolutely. Feed hygiene, I think, is something that we tend to not overlook as an industry, but we tend to see and say, well, yeah, I have these issues, but maybe I can't do anything about them, or we always have these issues, so no further action is required. But I think feed hygiene really is something that we all need to take quite seriously because it can be a production limiter. And so when we think about those things that we see most often, one of the biggest, I think, maybe misconceptions, and I think we're outgrowing this a little bit as an industry, but that when we have an issue on a farm, it's one problem. So we look for one particular issue to stand out and kind of explain all of those issues. And we look for, well, if XYZ mycotoxin is above the detectable limit or at concern limits, then we need to address it. However, most of the time when I get calls about issues on a dairy and we're looking at feed hygiene as a potential culprit, it's often a combination of these negative things working together that are leading to these issues. And so maybe it's not that one thing that we're looking to find, but it's a combination of things. And the interesting thing here is that that combination may not be terribly high levels of either. So one thing that I've seen quite frequently would be yeast and enterobacteria together. So yeast may be at moderate levels, enterobacteria may be at moderate levels, but when we combine those two together, we start to see cows come off feed. We start to see digestive upsets. We start to see losses. And so it's a really big issue when we get those two together. However, if you were just to test for yeast or just to test for enterobacteria, maybe we would say there isn't a problem with our feed hygiene. But as we look at the whole picture of what the cow is taking in, that's when we start to see a clearer picture. And I think this interesting dynamic of how toxins, yeasts, enterobacteria work together, not only in the rumen, but in the hindgut to create this slew of effects in the cow is really quite interesting. And I'm so excited to see what we learn about moving forward in this space, because I think there is a lot of unknown yet.
So this is an area of, I have limited to no expertise in. So if we can back up, so you're doing forward sampling on a routine basis. Are you typically sending out reports including yeast counts and enterobacteria counts, or is this something that they're only doing on a suspect case, or are there things in the bunk face that we can be looking at more closely that would give us a hint that there could be a problem beyond the normal molds that we might see from poor covering, et cetera?
Absolutely. So really people, again, this is a test that's done when we suspect an issue. So we're often a little bit retroactive in our testing for these feed hygiene parameters. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. We don't want to recommend going out and spending an inordinate amount of money on testing and these add-ons if they're not warranted. However, if we feel like we're not getting the productivity we expect, feed hygiene is definitely something to look at. So whether that ranges from maybe my cows are just a little bit loose to my dry matter intakes just aren't where I think they should be, then we can start digging a little bit deeper into these feed hygiene things. So one thing that I tend to recommend people look into would be, are we seeing heating? So is that TMR heating up during the day? Especially as we get into summer months, we start to see heating become more of an issue. When we look at our bunk face, is it hot? Do we see evidence of spoilage? Does it smell good? Or are there some off smells that maybe we need to look into? For silages, as you mentioned, that are high in ash, maybe we want to target our testing there first, because we know ash can create a challenging fermentation environment that can make an environment that's conducive to yeast and mold to grow. One of the challenges I think is so neat, but also not ideal for dairies, is the fact that as we start to get one of these negative feed hygiene parameters in, so as yeast start to grow, they can produce aerobic environments. And when we start produce those aerobic environments within the silage pot or within that silage itself, then we create an environment that's conducive for bacteria or for molds to grow. And as we start to raise that pH, so a lot of those yeast will utilize lactic acid and produce acetic acid. That'll raise the pH of our silage, and then that might make it conducive for enterobacteria to thrive. And so by having one of these, we start to create a condition where we can introduce others and create favorable conditions for other negative feed hygiene parameters to pop up. Likewise, we used to, when I was doing my graduate work, one of the things that kept me up at night is not knowing what happened to toxins when we put it into a silage pile. We know if they're in the field, or we might know that there's fungal disease in the field. We might know that we've got mycotoxins upon feed out. However, we didn't really have a clear grasp whether these toxins, the toxin levels stayed stagnant in a pile or whether they changed. However, recent research has showed us that DON levels can actually increase over time in a silage pile. They're not stable, they don't degrade, and in poor ensiling conditions, those can actually increase. So we're not safe. Even if we put it in at one level, we still want to test upon feed out if we know there's a concern, because that silage environment is so dynamic, and we really need to make sure that we do everything we can to try to keep it as stable as possible. Otherwise, we can get this downstream effect of all of these negative feed hygiene parameters coming into maybe one feed.
No, fascinating. Absolutely. Pivot again to talk about fecal analysis, because I think this is something that you've also focused on, and whether it's starch or proteins. And I think when I've interacted with nutritionists, many are using it as troubleshooting. Some are using it as a standard on the farm to evaluate how their diets are being digested. So my question to you is, how should nutritionists be using fecal analysis alongside with forage and TMAR testing to better understand the total digestion, the starch utilization, et cetera, of the diet that they've put together and that's been mixed properly and delivered to the cow?
Fecal matter, I mean, again, who likes to really talk about fecal stuff that much? But I think it is really interesting because it gives us an insight into what the cow is actually doing with our feed. And it gives us those opportunities. So things like fecal starch and fecal fat, now we can test through NIR. And so we have this opportunity to look at what the cow is doing with the starch that we're providing and if there's any opportunity to improve starch digestion. And now recently in the last 2 years, we found that we can do the same for fat. So we can look at the fat content of the manure, and that's actually somewhat related to the total tract fat digestibility, especially when we start pulling in how much fat we're feeding. And so it gives us opportunities to look at where we can fine tune these nutrients and where we can potentially gain more energy from these nutrients. So with things like NIR, they're really easy to test. They're really quick with results, and they're cost effective. So we can use these tools quite a bit to help benchmark within a herd, within groups within a herd, to make sure we're making improvements in the right direction. When it comes to things like fecal starch, we can look at year over year changes. And so it's been a really interesting crop year this year because we're seeing that our starch disappearance is a little bit lower in our corn grain. Our corn grain has a little bit lower starch. And so we can utilize tools like the fecal starch to make sure that we're getting enough energy to the cow, that she's utilizing that corn that we're providing as well as she can. When it comes to more extensive testing, we also have the ability to use something called a TMR digestibility assay. So we can take a TMR sample and a fecal sample at the same time. We can use a marker of indigestibility to help us look at how all of those nutrients are digesting. So this is more, again, because it's an extensive test, it's more of a troubleshooting tool, but I am hearing about more producers and more nutritionists using this to help fine tune the ration. So as we...
Yeah, sorry. You were saying, and it keyed in on the number of nutritionists. We probably want a lot more to be considering doing this approach and building up on this data and confidence of their diets?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, although we typically think about it as a troubleshooting thing, I think now with tight milk margins, with things getting a little bit harder in the industry, we're looking for that next way to gain that extra 2 to 5 pounds of milk to help our milk stretch a little bit further. And so tools like this can help us figure out, where is my fiber digestibility setting? Is there opportunity there? Where in my ration do I need to be focusing on to help maximize digestibility to get that next 2 to 5 pounds, 6 pounds, wherever we're looking for, but to move that needle forward. And so things like the TMR digestibility package or the TMR digestibility test can really help us do that because it puts it all out there and lets us see what our cows are actually doing with the feed that we have in front of them.
No, fascinating. And just on the practical aspect, are there recommendations, best management practices you would give nutritionists for sampling as well as submission of those fecal matter to your lab?
So from a sampling perspective on the fecal side, one thing, as I did my internship at Raver Lab, they tasked me with was looking at how logistics impact fecal starch levels. So if we know that shipping a sample in the heat, we get continual degradation of the starch. So especially in summer months, we want to freeze those samples before we send them. That's not a really fun thing to hone in on, but it makes a big difference because it can make a sizable difference in what we think is getting digested by the cow. So when we ship those samples, we want to make sure that we're getting it done right so we get the best possible answer. From a day-to-day standpoint, week-to-week standpoint, again, I think that varies about what can be done. It is a little bit trickier because we got to get out in pens. We got to take fecal samples. We got to make sure we're getting fresh fecal samples. We don't want a pile that's been sitting there for, 2 or 3 hours because, again, that starch can be degrading as it sits there in the pile. So when we do it, we want to make sure we're taking the right steps, getting fresh samples, making sure we're getting a representative sample from the pen. And then frequency will be as much as we can take on. And so that may be once a month for some herds. It could be every other week for some herds. We do have some herds that are testing fecal starches more aggressively. When it comes to TMRD, I think getting a baseline is really important. And so if we can just spot check when things are going well about what our baseline really is, that'll help us understand opportunities moving forward. Or if something changes and we want to test again for the negative, or something changes for the negative and we want to test again, what changed from that baseline? So I think always having that baseline is good, and taking those intermittently to establish that baseline, even when we don't perceive a problem, I think is a really good step. And I think that resonates for sampling across the board. We want to create that baseline, whether it be for our commodities, our forages, our digestibility. We need that baseline to know where we're going and to help us make sure we're achieving our goals.
And I'm sure if a nutritionist listening wanted to reach out and help design a sampling protocol, you're all ears, ready to help.
Absolutely. I love doing it because it gives us an opportunity to understand, again, what drives producers, what drives nutritionists, what goals they're looking at achieving. And those conversations are always so fun to have.
So a little unfair final question. You give nutritionists just one habit or approach that would help them to get more value at a lab analysis and how that's applied right down the farm level of increasing the efficiency of milk production, what would that be?
Oh, that's a tricky one, because to narrow it down to just one.
Well, how about two then? I'll give you two.
Okay, perfect. So the first one would be test all your feeds at some routine frequency. And that doesn't have to be on a herd-to-herd basis. But when we look at commodities, understanding and creating a baseline for the regional area of feeds that you're sourcing, I think is really important, because we have recognized substantial variation between book values and what we're seeing on farm. That makes a whole lot of sense. There's variation in what we're feeding and processing year to year. And so just understanding what that is, where you're at, I think will really help fine tune that ration, make what we're doing on paper match what's getting fed to the cows, but also help us understand economic opportunities of where we could maybe fine tune and cut things a little bit tighter, or cut our wiggle room around what we formulate a little bit closer. So that's one. And I think that routine frequency can, again, be based off of comfort levels and timing. So whether it be monthly, quarterly, twice a year, just taking some samples and creating that library of values that you want to use, I think is a really critical step. And then number two would be looking at trends over time. So again, by that temptation to just look at our single sample and use that single sample, but track what's going on our forages over time. So even if that we're only sampling once a month, once every other week, once a week, tracking those changes over time will give us better insight into how our feed is changing, what we might be able to look out for in the future, making sure that the sample that we're taking is representative of what's going on too. So ensuring good sampling practices, but using our data to help make sure that we are getting those good sampling practices and that our data is representative of what we're feeding to cows.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for those take-homes. And so as we wrap up, Katie, I want to thank you for being with us today. It's been a real joy and helping and for you to share and for me to better understand, the audience to understand your knowledge and experience. So thanks again for that.
Well, and thanks for having me on today and giving me the time to talk about feed again. It's always a joy to have these conversations and to hopefully provide your audience with a few take-home points that maybe they can implement to improve rations and sampling and improve the dairies that they work with.
Great. And I always want to thank our audience for being with us today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Rumination Podcast. You can do that on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, as well as check us out at jeffo.ca. And feel free to always encourage you to visit us at jeffo.ca for more information about what we do, these podcasts, etc. This podcast was brought to you by Jeffo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. And have a great day.